Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today, an original tag that I was tagged in, and since yesterday was Tuesday, you're going to guess the source of this. The guys at Stripcover Lit have charged into 2019 with just their usual terrier energy. And one of the things they've decided to do, at least for the first few months of the year, is new tags every Tuesday. I hope they keep doing it forever, because who knew that they had this kind of talent for tags? Every one of them has been a winner. They're on an incredible roll when it comes to great tags, and this latest one is no exception to that. It's wonderfully amorphous, and it's also wonderfully personal. I want everybody to do it, which is always the sign of a great tag, is that you see it, and in addition to wanting to do it yourself, you want everybody you watch to do it as well. And it's called the Your Readership Tag. It's just a few questions I thought we'd go through before I tag Britta. The first one is, what influenced your beginning? Who influenced your beginning as a reader? Dalton, in his answers, talked about teachers and parents and whatnot. I have one answer. A great teacher. I had a great teacher who showed me that books were a world, could be an adventure, were the best adventure, the best thrill, the best way to challenge yourself, the bravest thing that you can do. And I had never thought of it that way before, and I had reason when he challenged me to think that way. I had reason to at least hear him out, and I'm glad I did. It was a gift I can never repay. The most I can try to do is what you do with a gift like that. You can't ever just go back and discreetly repay it. Instead, you have to just try and pay it forward. I have tried ever since then to also encourage other people to think of reading as an adventure and as the time of their lives and as such enormous fun and as something that can just double and triple the size of your life. And I'm going to keep trying to do that. So for me, it was one person. It was one discrete teacher. After that came schooling. After that came college courses and long conversations with literary figures and whatnot, and with other critics and whatnot. But first, there was a teacher. One great teacher. Question number 2 is, what is the first book that you remember? It was a pamphlet, I believe. It was very popular. It was on everybody's mind. It was on everybody's tongue. And that's the first thing that was any kind of a book that I remember. I know that's a little vague. It probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it wasn't really a particular book. I was not a reader. When I was first aware of books, let's just put it that way. I was not a reader. I became aware of them as objects, as weird cultural things, before I became aware of them as anything that had an interior dimension of their own, much less TARDIS-like, an infinite interior dimension of their own. And question number 3, what is the first book that impacted you? And that fingers on chalkboard sound is what you get when a grown adult who should know better uses the word impact as a verb, especially when, and the reason that I know that Dalton, who did this tag, knows better, is because a second later, in the body of the question, he actually uses the word influence, which is what he means for impacted. The only way that even in grossly colloquial terms, the only way that a book is going to impact you is if it falls off a high shelf and hits you. And even then, it didn't impact you. It hit you and had an impact. Impact is a noun. Anyway, when you're talking about a book, the first book that influenced me, it would be the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. I know this sounds so awful. All these answers sound so awful. I should be talking about Harry Potter, I know. But it was Homer's Iliad, and it influenced me because I had, until that point, until I first really encountered Homer's Iliad, I had considered literature to be fake, stiff, a stylistic enterprise, a rhetorical exercise, rather than anything real. And then I read the Iliad, which had real combat. It had real people, three-dimensional, fallible people. It gave us 4 lines perfectly hatching out a person's character, only to then in the next 4 lines kill them grotesquely and accurately. It had all sorts of things that did not feel like they were carved in marble on Mount Olympus, despite the fact that, obviously, given the subject matter, I was expecting that. And it changed everything for me. It proved to me, it was the proof to me that my teacher had been right. I was willing to take him at his word. I was willing to listen, and even, God help me, to parrot. But it was only independent, as it ever is. It was only independent of him that I discovered that he was right. Where I went to something that he had praised, and it worked. And it wasn't just that I was making myself see things that he said were there, because he was very elliptical on what I might find. Said he didn't want to poison it for me. Instead, I found a whole bunch of other things, and we talked about it for the rest of his life. And it was all true. What he said great reading could be was right there in the Iliad. So, so that was the first one. Question number 4. What author was your first love? Catullus. Question number 5. What is one book that's been on your TBR too long? They don't stay there very long. If by TBR you mean books that I'm going to get to, not old standards. Old standards come and go. I get rid of them. I read them. But in terms of books that I mean to get to, there are probably August books that I haven't touched yet that I will get to. But I don't know that I count that as a TBR, because I wouldn't get to them anyway. It's not like I will read them when they come to bear, but I wouldn't read most of them now anyway. so I'm not sure that counts. I don't think that I can answer this question. I don't, like I've mentioned on this channel many, many times, I don't do TBRs the way most people do. I can't. So let's just move on and see what question number 6 is. What is your go-to suggestion for a new or lapsed reader to get back into reading? And any of you have been a bookseller. I was a bookseller for a quarter of a century. And this is a frequent question. To put it mildly, this is a frequent question. And it's not one that you can have a cookie-cutter answer to unless you're a bad bookseller. If someone comes to your bookstore and you're in an information desk, or they come to you and you're working there and they ask you, can you make me a book recommendation? And without knowing anything at all, without knowing anything about what they want to read, you recommend the latest, I don't know, feminist agitprop or dude bro bestseller or whatever. When you hand them an ideology, when they're looking for a recommendation, you have failed them. You have done a bad job at what is essentially the only human element of your job. A machine can do the rest of it. So when I was a bookseller, I never did anything like that. Never. Customers sometimes insist on it. Customers themselves would. They'd come up and say, look, I'm looking for a recommendation for a book. I want to get back into reading. And I would do what I always did, which is to say, okay, this is a brief conversation that we need to have. You're not at a Home Depot and you need a lug wrench this size, and here I've got this lug wrench this size. I need to ask you the last few books that you read and liked, what you're in the mood for now, what you definitely aren't in the mood to read. And I had customers over the course of those 25 years say, look, I never mind with all the details, just make a recommendation. And I would always try to be reasonable. I would always try to talk them out of a self-evidently ridiculous and irrational standpoint. One time only, in 1992 or 3, I was standing with a customer just next to a random bookshelf, and he actually did say, you know, never mind all that, I just want a recommendation. And while still looking at him, I did this. I reached totally blindly at random, pulled a book out. It was like the 3rd book in a Nora Roberts series. And said, here you go. And he said, is this good? And I said to him, you just explicitly told me you don't care whether it's good. So don't ask. And that actually, even in that case, that calmed him down enough so that he actually did sit and answer some questions. It's the only way to do it that has any chance of being more than just someone reaching at random for a shelf. So I would always ask people, what are the last few books that you read and liked? What are some no-go areas, some places that you absolutely won't read? Is there any sense in me recommending a long biography, for instance? And I would also ask them, in addition to all that, tell me about your reading muscles. What kind of reading shape are you in now? Because reading is a muscle. It's not a God-given gift. It's a muscle, like anything else. The more you use it, the better shape it gets in, from couch potato all the way to Olympic athlete. And so I would ask people, in a friendly, but a definitely direct way, what kind of shape are your reading muscles in? Do you want something long? Do you want something complex? Do you want something simpler? Most of the time, people wanted fiction. You just expect that. And then in fiction, people have their own preferences. It turned out, in the course, I must have been asked this question a million times when I was a bookseller, and it usually turned out that customers were after the first initial awkwardness, they were complimented by the fact that I was taking the time to learn about their reading habits rather than just making a blind recommendation. Blind recommendations are ideological, and ideologues have no place in bookstores. That's a rant for another day. In terms of candidates, there are a couple. I've mentioned a few on this channel before. If a customer answered my questions, if we got to the point where the customer was saying, I want a medium-length novel, I don't want nonfiction, I don't want anything heavy, I don't want anything long, I don't want anything too terribly depressing, I want something that maybe has an element of suspense or action, but that has a brain behind it and will keep me interested. I especially want the book, because my reading muscles are not in the best shape possible, the book is going to have to do more than 50% of the work to keep me reading. That isn't the case once your reading muscles are in good shape. Then you do 50-50. The break starts at 50-50 for in-shape reading muscles, and it goes up from there. Okay? I realize there's a substantial crowd of people on BookTube who embrace the Sean the Book Maniac method of bailing on a book the minute your muscles are threatened, the minute your muscles are exercised at all. I argue, as much as I love Sean and his channel, I argue that that is long-term incredibly harmful. It encourages you to keep your muscles in the flabby shape they're in. It never grows them. Because some books, if you meet them 75% of the way, they'll change you forever. It turns out they're worth it. They're just, some cats don't want to be petted. Others come right onto your lap. It doesn't mean that the ones that don't want to be petted should be abandoned. I just used a cat analogy. Oh my God. But when a customer would get to that point, leaving aside the whole, we'll just dodge all these longer videos. We'll get to them eventually. Leaving aside that longer point, when a customer would get to that point and say, a novel, something that will do maybe more than half the work to keep me reading, something I won't want to put down. I did have a few go-to recommendations, and one of the first of them was The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. His novel about the Battle of Gettysburg, that customers would scrunch up their face, and I would say, you don't have to care about the Battle of Gettysburg. You don't have to know anything about Civil War history. I'm only telling you that's what it is, because that's what it is, not because that will recommend it to you. You don't have to know anything at all about any of it to read this book and love it. And for those 25 years, I had a standard line where I would tell customers, once we got to that point in the conversation, I would tell them, if you don't like this book, I'll buy it back from you. It's the only time I ever said that, and it was the only book I ever said it about. And I never had anyone take me up on it. I had lots of customers come in and say, oh man, if all books were like this, I would read all the time. And then I tell them, there are enough books like that as a reading experience for you to keep reading them one after another without ever stopping for the rest of your natural life. And they would say, well, where are they? How do I get these books? And I would say, there's one way, and that's to let me determine your reading. Not me in some general sense, me personally. Let me determine your reading. Not just sometimes, but every book. You let me do that, you'll never have a disappointment. Never. Every single reading experience you have from now until you die will be just that kind of radioactively glowing reading experience that we all love. Because I have been there. I have been there. I've been out in the wilderness reading everything that doesn't work in order to find the things that do. I've done far more of that exploratory reading than most people have, so I'm ready to help. At the low cost of your free will. I had a few customers take me up on it. And one of them, amazingly, is still at it. One of them, when she finishes the book, she said, okay, I'm ready for my next Steve book. And in her case, usually, we've been doing it so long now, 40 years, that I not only make her a Steve recommendation, but I mail it to her. And every time, it's right. I know exactly what she likes. And I know how she can, expand what she likes. We do it little by little. She herself has commented that she's a much more adventurous reader now than she was when we first met. When we first met, I recommended a whole bunch of things to her, but I would never have recommended Thomas Pynchon. Now she's a Pynchon fan. And I can do that with anybody. But I used to do that all the time. And The Killer Angels was one of those books where it virtually cannot fail. If that's the thing that the person was interested in. I had plenty of people say, no, I don't want to read fiction at all. Needless to say, I understood. So that's the incredibly long answer to that question. I don't have a go-to suggestion, just a blanket go-to suggestion. Once I get a reader to a certain point, if they're at that point, then The Killer Angels might be one of those recommendations. But there might be others. Somebody's looking for a very long book that isn't historical in any way. I want a very long book. I want to immerse myself. It still has to be a novel. Well, there's Moving On by Larry McMurtry. Also can't go wrong. So, and there are plenty of other examples. So, anyway, question number 7 is, what are you currently reading? Bean, what are you doing? What are you doing? Don't do that. Books are your friend. What you're currently reading, I'm not going to stop reading a book in order to make a video. Okay, so I finished a book. I finished a book this morning. It was this one. An Elegant Defense. This is my second time through. This is a book about the human immune system. And it's lavishly illustrated, and it's lively written. Boy, oh boy. Wonderful, wonderful book. The author goes at the vagaries and the limits of the human immune system by looking at a few very isolated cases, a few, not to use a harsh word, but freakish cases of the human immune system. People whose immune systems did weird things, and could thereby allow the author to talk about the whole spectrum of the human immune system. I thought it was just terrific. And before that, for a huge chunk of time, before An Elegant Defense, it was the Catholic school, that mammoth that we saw on this channel, that I have just been... I've read the whole thing. I've been going back into it. It's a big gravitational pull for me to just do that and nothing else. And I can't do nothing else. But I'll talk about that book in due course when I'm talking about March of the Mammoth. But next up on the list, what is next on the list? Do I have it here? Oh, yes. Okay. It's a thin book. We saw it on this channel. It's a thin book on cities. A 6,000-year history of cities. It's just a tiny little thing. And I read it. I read the advanced copy right after I got it. Thought it was very well done. I want to read it again because I'm going to incorporate it into a review that's coming up in April. So that's the next thing. Won't take more than an hour. And then we'll be on to something else. So that's what I'm reading now. I'm not reading anything right at the moment. I'm making a video right at the moment. But I'm in between the human immune system and a history of human cities. And then the last part was a bonus thing that Dalton wanted to include. How has literature touched you or influenced you? Of course, an enormous question. You could make a whole video about this. For my sake, in my case, it has touched me in the way that I mentioned in the first answer, which is that it gave me myself. It has allowed me a vocabulary and an arena in which to establish who I am. It's been an incalculable gift, an amazing thing that I would probably have ignored for my whole life. So I ask people all the time, how do non-readers do it? How do they do it? I don't understand how they do it. I have to assume it's that they don't know what they're missing. But that's the way that it's influenced me, and of course, affected me. And the way that it's influenced me is very practical. From early on, from a very, very long time ago, I realized that I really like to talk about books, and I also like to write about them. And the way I write about them is as though I were talking about them. It's a particular kind of thing. It's not scholarly. It's not steep or intellectual. But it's also not, whiz and bang. It respects the reader's intelligence. I had, in other words, I discovered a long, long time ago, kind of a voice when it comes to writing about books. I have a writerly voice, which, as I've mentioned in writer videos on this channel, is tough to come across. A lot of writers don't know what their voice is. A lot of them don't know how to find it. I kind of do. I feel fairly certain that in most cases, especially when I've got a little head of steam, if you were to take my name off a book review and read it, you could tell that it was mine. Or at least you'd make a really good guess in that regard. So, and because I discovered that, I also learned that you could make money. I started making money, started making a living. Then I stopped and was a bookseller for a long time. Now I started up again in the last 15 years. And now literature has the most practical connection to my life you could possibly have. It's my livelihood. Reading and writing about what I read are how I put dog food on the table. So I actually don't put dog food on the table. I put it on the floor, but you know what I mean. But thinking about that myself, there's an inner dimension, as profoundly personal an inner dimension as you could possibly want. I wouldn't recognize myself without reading. There's also a very practical dimension. I have deadlines every day. I have a balance sheet at the end of every month. I have editors to deal with. I have publicists and publishers and writers to deal with. There's a very practical element to that as well. But thinking about that dichotomy really made me want to hear everybody else do this bonus thing. So if you do this tag, make sure to do the bonus. The bonus is one of the most interesting things in it. And then we tag people. I thought one of the funnest bits of Dalton's tag was that he tagged Adrian. But I want to tag, of course, Britta. Because we were Skyping just the other day in one of our dude bro conversations, and she said, I don't have enough tags in my life. I'm here to help. But also Richardson Reads. I have a feeling that late at night over wine, or perhaps a huge amount of wine in the little farmhouse in Vermont, I have a feeling I probably heard some of the answers to some of these questions. I'd love to hear them all in one place, and a lot of people haven't had the privilege. But also Olive. Again, I think probably her answers to a lot of these questions are scattered throughout her videos, but I'd love to hear it. David Murphy, a booktuber who is new to me, really, really loving his channel. I'll leave a link to all these people. You don't need a link to Olive, but I'll do it anyway. Coles to Newcastle. But David Murphy could certainly use a couple hundred more subscribers. He's got a really thoughtful channel. And also my sister from another Mr. Sarah at Steeped in Books. I would love to hear your answers to these questions in the very brief and constantly shrinking interval between now and when we do tags together on camera. Because she's coming to Boston BookTube. The two booktubers who are voted most likely to snort charcoal at their own jokes will be in the same videos. I don't know if you can handle that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That was a wonderful tag. Thank you very much, Dalton, for tagging me, even though, as you point out in your video, it is kind of mandatory to tag me. I still appreciate that you did it. But we have lots of other stuff to talk about, so I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.